Welcome to Untangling the World Knot of Consciousness, wrestling with the hard problems of mind and meaning in the modern scientific age. My name is John Vervaeke. I'm a cognitive psychologist and a cognitive scientist at the University of Toronto in Canada. Throughout the entire series, I will be joined in dialogue by my good friend and colleague, Gregg from James Madison University in the United States. Throughout, we are going to wrestle with the hard problems of how we can give an account of a phenomenon like consciousness within the scientific worldview, how we can wrestle with that problem in conjunction with the problem that Gregg calls the problem of psychology that is pervasive throughout psychology, which is that psychology has no unified descriptive metaphysics by which it talks about mind and or behavior. Throughout this, we will be talking about some of the most important philosophical, cognitive scientific, and neuroscientific accounts of consciousness. So I hope you'll join us throughout. It came to fantastic fruition in our last discussion. We had sort of a dialectical dialogos insight together, which I think is really important. You're going to be taking the lead, and I'm going to be more of the Socratic interlocutor. And so I turn things over to your capable hands.
All right, man. This is great. This is dialogos in action, as far as I'm concerned, right? And my hope for this whole project, and I think obviously it came from your notion, was we could show, scholars coming together and dialoguing and see what happens. And we definitely synced up on something that I've been excited about. So I'm really looking forward to getting back into this and sharing and then seeing where it takes us. So I'll do my thing. I'll pull up the slides. And what I've got here is a 10-minute or so walkthrough, and the audience can then see you and I have done some texting, but we bridged it in terms of the framing of it, and then we'll see where that takes us. Okay?
Excellent. Excellent. So take away.
Yep. Okay. So we talked at the end of the last episode, there was this whole issue of pleasure and pain. And what is that? How it sat in my, and then it really, as we were syncing up, it was like, okay, what's adjectival? That clarified. And then what are these things? And we called them normative qualia. I think certainly my feeling on that was exactly right in the sense that there was some sort of evaluation or element along those lines. But normative for me was often gets entangled sort of in justification and what are norms.
Totally. And that launches us way up the hell into the propositional level. So we had I think it was the right idea, but exactly the wrong term. It was an implicitist term, I think, for capturing it.
Well, and so then anyways, I was digesting it. It's an investment value system that BIT says. So I then said valuation, but that essentially had the same problem. And then, valence hooked for me, and I sent you, and we had some dialogue, and you immediately honed in on that. And so valence qualia is an idea. And so really what this is now we're simmering on the possibility of valence qualia. Does this really fit? Right. And so we're in the rawness of it, folks. This is what scholars try to get. It's like, hey, does this sync up?
Yeah, very much. Kind of exciting. So exciting, eh? That was like a trip last time.
Yeah,
I love it. I love it when that happens.
Yeah. So this whole bridge then, which I've always felt, and I really feel is just going to continue. So we have this SIMM-RR BIT linkage here, and then they give rise to this new territory. So anchoring somewhere from where I'm coming from, there's this whole operant experiential world of perception relative to motivation, relative to emotion. And there's some control theory model. And this is a base above reflexive activity that's going to then correspond to operant theory. And the idea here is that at some level, you're going to get some sort of pleasure-pain broadcast function. Okay? That's going to have some capacity. This is before global neuronal workspace, but there is some sort of yoking capacity where pain pulls for sensory perception together with energizing action together. And pleasure's doing the same kind of thing. So if we think about this as sort of an intersecting broadcast function along these lines. So now if we then say, okay, the idea that pleasure and pain serve that function, they're going to orient the animal either to approach or avoid in particular ways, and evolving to link sensation, perception, and emotion together. And then this gives this idea of valence qualia emerge and function to hierarchically integrate sensory input with motor output to enable a more holistic dynamic modeling system, okay, to guide the animal to approach and avoid. We're talking about foundational law of effect here in some ways.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay?
Yep.
And operant experiential. And then this opens up this idea, okay, of there is, hey, we're really creating a dynamic modeling relation of the animal environment relation, right?
Right. Yep, very much.
The potential for the base of participatory knowledge here.
Yep. I think that's great. Yeah, I mean, and you and I were talking about their weird phenomenological feel, right?
Yes.
That they hang below the adverbial and the adjectival, right? In this really interesting way, and they give you just this very the crudest possible sort of proto-phenomenological orientation, right?
Brilliant.
Right. And then the idea, and you're right, the participatory knowing, right? It's simultaneously a knowing and a being, knowing by being, right? And so, yeah, all of that is just, I think that's just really starting to bring the functionality and the phenomenology and the primordialness all together. And the idea that these operate as basically sort of your really, really primitive of, affordance landscaping, which is what the participatory knowing does. And then that's going to make and afford the possibility of the adverbial qualia as, specifications of, I'm thinking of the valence qualia like as these, orientation thing, and then they get specified into the here-ness, now-ness, togetherness of the adverbial, etc. And then they get made ready for reason by the adjectival. Sorry, I'm stealing your thunder. I'm just excited.
And I'm going to come back to a personal story that I think will yoke that together in a second here. Okay, right. So that's exactly the energy. And by the way, I'll make a little forecasting here. Okay, that our fields of phenomenology, your and mine, me getting to know you and you getting to know me, we're starting to create an intersubjective, participatory underlying dynamic.
Yeah.
Our friendship, you can feel that. All right. And that's a foreshadowing to a couple of things down the road here in terms of what are the relational influence matrix and ultimately self kinds of notions. So I just want to make that. So I'm loving that because I'm seeing your mirror, we're getting mirror neuron action, because as you get excited, I'm like, oh, that's exactly where I am. Okay. So here's our architecture. Okay, so we get rid of, we have the top of proposition, but we get rid of that. We have the center here of, there's this adjectival, and I'm going to put a word here of gestalt that I want to come back to. Okay? Adjectival gestalt, and adverbial quality, witness. Okay. And then we have this idea about valence at the base.
Okay?
So now here's the story that I want to tell you about, and see how this resonates with exactly what you were saying. Okay, so base sentience, but not full phenomenological consciousness. Okay. So my son John, my wife was my son John. My wife was a soccer coach, coaching him. He was, I think, 9 at the time, playing. He fell awkwardly, okay, and fell down. My wife, hey, are you okay? He turns around, and his arm is completely vertical, off key in a horrible way. So that's like, the whole system. So we race there, eventually get called, and we're over there. I arrive, everybody's a little freaked out, but he's calmed down. But it's a nasty break, okay? And they're going to then try to set it, okay? So the ER then is going to set the bone. But thankfully, we live in a modern day, not in 100 years ago. That would have been. So what do? They anesthetize them, okay? So they're going to give them anesthetize. And we were just standing there, and the ER people were like, well, you may want to leave the room. And I was like, why? And they were like, well, the body reacts.
Right.
Okay. All right. And we said, well, we don't want to leave. We just can't leave our son. So we're just going to be here. Okay. So the next 15 minutes, they knock him out. And then the doctors, and they hold him down. Okay. As the doctors move the arm around. Okay. So they've knocked him out. And what is the body doing? He is moaning and pulling. The affordance, of the agony is embedded in his body.
Right.
Okay. And so he's moving around and wailing and moaning. All right. And then they actually takes him 3 times. They're gonna have to do a slight surgery. It's a stressful reality for this. But anyway, here's the funny part, or the hysterical part of it. My wife and I will always remember this. So 20 minutes later or whatever, he's coming around, And he goes from, you know, just starting to wake up to boom, he sits up and he goes, I'm alive.
Yeah.
All right. So the idea here is that, you know, that the adjectival, adverbial, you know, witnessing and justifying consciousness, the thing's taken offline,
Yeah.
but embedded in the embodiment of affordance, you know, this hurts like hell at a embodied level, but we can disconnect it with anesthesia and turn the observing consciousness system off, and then it comes back online. And so that connection between non-conscious but still embodied pleasure pain kind of dynamic is brought to life with that story, I think.
That's cool. That's very cool.
So basically this idea is that there's some sort of emergent shouting in the dark because it doesn't have a witness function. And then you get over evolutionary time, you get the valence qualia become consolidated by adverbial qualia.
Yeah, actualize, exactly, yeah.
The elements associated, this is the witness function. Adjectival qualia experience qualitative properties of the aspectualized gestalt on the screen of attention.
Right.
Okay? And I use the word gestalt here because this is another area in which you and I are syncing up, and it actually echoes a history in the problem of psychology between the structuralist and the gestaltist, which is the idea, the structuralist like Edward Titchener coming off of is the idea that, okay, there are all these parts that are the qualia are the base sensory elements, right? And that's really what that somehow those things exist first, and then they're pieced together somehow, and they grow, and then they turn into. And the Gestalt said, no way. Okay, what's actually happening is that you see patterns, and the whole pops, and then if you introspect, you can say, yes, I see what green is, but you actually see the meadow, and the green is some other thing. Okay. So for me, and this is the question sort of I wanted to ask you, is that as that witnessing function comes along and is aspectualizing, it then is pulling the top-down, bottom-up processes together.
Totally.
Right?
Totally.
And then essentially pulls the gestalt, the screen of consciousness gestalt up, and it's those elements that are adjectival.
I think insofar as we understand that gestalt and feature are relative terms like tall.
Absolutely.
So they gestalt, if you allow me to turn it into a verb, they gestalt up, right?
Yes.
But they are they're sort of featural foundations for for conceptual content, propositional content. And that's so there's the upward looking face of adjectival qualia and the downward looking face of adverbial qualia. That's how I'm seeing what you're saying.
Perfect. That's exactly what I'm saying. Okay. And what I'm saying is then that it is this bottom up, top down interface, okay, that we can that can allow us to gain much more specificity on these domains.
Yep. That's right. What we're seeing is a progression of specification, right? You've got orientation and valence specified into aspects with adverbial, and then it's going to get specified into proto-representational content, right, with the adjectival, and then that gets specified into, justifiable truth claims. That's what I'm seeing. That's what I'm seeing here going on.
Exactly. And in fact, actually, what will then happen, what I would argue, is that as this thing, okay, so now these perspectival experience have an exterior, so these are what comes in from the exterior. I see this Coke can as outside, right? I can also feel I just ate, so I feel something in my stomach on the inside. And those intersections are also then, I can also feel, hey, I'm feeling joy. Good things are happening, so I feel the joy. So that's the affect, okay? So that then creates the particular screen. Then I can run simulations, imaginations on particular domains, and now I get up into my creative imaginative, right? Okay? So now to complete the thought of what you were saying is what I believe happens with the human is when we get really rich shared attentional space, that's going to create a lot of texture in this domain, okay? A lot of rich self-other texture and shared intersubjective space, and we'll be talking about that in a second, all right? And then what you have is you have figure-ground relations, which then allow for the object to be then tagged as a noun, okay? And then the change of object will tag over time, and then the various differences in the properties is the adjectives. So you get nouns, adjectives, and verbs that are then tagged, okay, in the symbol. So the perceptual field will have the object, the change, and the property difference which are nouns, verbs, and adjectives as the fundamental units. Okay.
For propositional processing.
Right, well, these are the symbolic elements, and then we put them in syntax, and then the syntax, once the symbol gets locked into self-other syntax, then they have propositional meaning, and then boom, we're in the propositional world.
That's excellent. So I wanted to ask you about just that, because like when you're at that level of the intersubjective, you're getting multiperspective. That's affording metacognition, right? Vygotsky kind of arguments. But I'm also thinking of like, because it seems to me that these two things emerge together, and so I wanted to ask you about that. So when I can start doing multi-perspectival, that's going to afford counterfactuality, right? Because then I can consider other than I see it, which is, I think, the proto beginnings of counterfactuality. And then counterfactuality brings up it could be other, and then that brings up the fact that it can be other is what you need in order for should. Should makes no sense. I mean, it's the classic Kantian thing, right? Ought implies can. Right? You have to have a modal sense that it can be other or could be other in order to bring in the should. So it sounds to me like this ability, the intersubjective stuff is going to afford counterfactuality, and that's immediately going to require something like justification in order to manage the relationship between how it is and how it could be.
Good.
Am I sort of understanding that?
Yes, although what I would say is that there is a fundamental difference. So what's happening when we get into sort of the influence matrix, which then is going to set the stage for this self-other relating, which is going to set the stage for a much better meta-representation of possibility, which then sets the stage for counterfactual possible outcomes.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
But these are all nonverbal simulations at this juncture. Okay. Right. So the nonverbal simulation allows for a lot more creativity and a lot more potential thought, like that we see when we see animals act really intelligently.
Like the Caledonian Post making tools in one location and taking it to another. That requires counterfactual thought. That's your point.
Exactly. Exactly.
Right.
And I would guess, or Kafka, the Wolfgang Kohler's chimps are doing certain kinds of modeling at this level. All right. Then they put the boxes up and then they climb and they got a moment of insight. Okay.
So it's clear in your mind that the counterfactual ability precedes but it would also make possible sort of a justification requirement, right?
Right. For me, the issue, there's really two layers. So the counterfactual is to be a simulate, once you open up intense simulation, and then you open up intersubjective simulation together, every time you're opening up a space, you're also opening up a negative. Okay, so in other words, as combinatorial explosion. So there is the requirement of creativity requires constraints. And I think of those constraints as the capacity of an animal to manipulate. Well, is it down this path or is it down this path?
Right.
How do we judge that? Okay, and then it might not be down that path. Now, they're not saying that in propositional language, but they are simulating it in frontal lobe space.
Yeah, some sort of meta-perspectival ability.
Some sort of, meta-representational perspectival, exactly. Yeah. Okay, and I believe that the more fluidity that you would have is going to then also, if you then have additional working memory space for the opportunity for symbolic tagging of those cognitive gadgets and their potential, that's then going to set the stage for a language acquisition device, okay? And then symbolic syntactic, and then I am very keen on once you get symbolic syntactical propositional, then there's really concrete propositional assertions and questions, which are concrete counterfactual potentials.
Right. I see what you're saying.
And so it's a layered, multi-layered system here of simulation, and then we're guiding, but you cannot, my dog Benji really socially guided you, blah, blah, blah. And we have good relation now as our bond deepens and all of this. But man, figuring out whether or not, what he really thinks and what's justified at that level is a real task.
Yeah.
real lock there.
I don't know if I did this before. Bertrand Russell's quote about no matter how eloquently the dog barks, it can't tell you that its parents were poor but hardworking.
Yeah.
Right. That kind of thing.
That kind of deal.
So you can't have any explanatory justification kind of moves made until you've got the full-blown syntactic language. So that's the move that you're.
That's the move.
Right.
And I'll share my friend and original mentor and our colleague, was Associate Dean. I don't think I shared it with you. I've mentioned a couple. I'm sorry if it's redundant. But his college invited Jane Goodall to give their commencement address, and he happened to have lunch or dinner with her. And because he's familiar with it, he was like getting all the rich mental lives of chimpanzees. And he asked her, he's like, well, do they ever do anything like justify? And her answer was point blank, no. They would never be able to do that. Yeah. I will say I worked some with Sue Savage Rumbaugh, who worked with bonobos, and she did believe, in fact, we almost went to the Great Ape Trust and worked on testing whether or not we could decode whether kanzi or the other linguistically fluid apes, which have symbol, but whether they have propositional and whether you can engage in question answers.
That's very controversial. Yeah. I think Brickerton's right that they have proto-language. They don't have syntactic language.
Right. So we were in disagreement. She thought they could, and I was like, and then we were thinking about experiments, and then it got derailed for completely other reasons. But there you go. Yes, for me, there is a hard line of propositional justification, and that is and that opens up an adjacent possible space over the last 50,000 years that explodes us into.
No, I'm in agreement on how this argument unfolds. Yeah.
So
excellent.
I also then, because you come back and you made such a very important point to me, we'll see if this jives about what a pure consciousness event. It seems to me that this is an adverbial witness function where that aspectualizes itself almost.
Yeah, exactly. I think so.
Okay, so it's creates some perceived meditative loop, and that closes in and sort of collapses into being itself. It's really, I'd have never had that experience, but.
And I was thinking about this, and I think you might agree with this. It's the adjectival qualia. I'm sorry, not the adjectival. The adverbial qualia, almost getting back down to like what you have with the valence, where it's just right. You know it by being it, right? It's a pure knowing by being, right, kind of thing.
Right, and I think that opens people up when they talk about non-dual, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there is where the perceiver and perceived are one. In a particular kind of way.
Exactly. Yeah. It's interesting though that, like I said, in addition, I hadn't thought about this because I always talk about the how aspectuality and centrality and how the here-ness, the now-ness, and the togetherness are still in the pure consciousness event, but so is valence because it's experienced as overwhelmingly positive.
Yep. Okay. Right. And that and you can then totally see how then you would then interpret that in a particular ontology as connecting to the cosmic consciousness. Right?
Yeah, something like that. Exactly.
Right. Yeah. So, all right. Well, I think we're synced.
Yeah. Very cool.
Okay. So now what I'm going to do, and then we'll come back and we can then riff a little bit more, but this then potentially bridges us up to the next thing so now we have this adverbial, adjectival, and valence qualia. And now I just want to emphasize there's the back end of the energizing emotion, okay?
Right.
So behavior investment theory and law of effect suggest a pleasure-pain parallel fitness principle, and I mean that both evolutionarily or phylogenetically and developmentally or ontogenetically.
Right.
Okay? And this then provides a potential grounding then for participatory dynamic feedback.
Right.
Okay, we are talked about valence quality linking directly a concept of emotion defined as and the most base level of energized motion, or preparing energized motion. When we put it in behavioral investment terms, we then will see two broad axes of motivated emotional response set. Of course, the first is this valence of approach avoid. And the second, because the behavioral investment theory is always highlighting energy economics kinds of issues, becomes an active spend versus passive conserve dimension.
Yep, very much.
So that's always that kind of view.
That just maps into relevance realization, just totally.
Completely. And in terms of it, the logic of it gives rise to a very well documented empirical reality about emotion, which is the circumplex model of emotion and mode, okay? Which is this thing whereby we have, if you do a 2x2, pleasure, pain, active, passive, you get an affective fear, okay? And if somebody works all the time with both anxiety and depression disorders, you're gonna see that in terms of what happens to systems over time is they get into various attractor states. So an active fear that threat is emerging is what we call generalized anxiety when the entire system is feeding back on it. Fear and anxiety are a little different. Anxiety is more the mood. And it's because it's more cognitively diffuse. Fear is more, I know what the stimulus is that I want to avoid, but they are cousins. And the active pleasure, desire, okay, drive to desire. Passive pain, depression, this is my particular area of expertise, is what is clinical depression, how do you treat that? And the reverse is the passive content. After you achieve goal, okay, orientation, you experience contentment. There's actually a comment here then about an interesting point about, because I'm feeling a little charged, what is mania? Mania is really when you feel desire and goal attainment, instead of getting contentment and having a state reduction, it actually elevates you further and there's no counterbalance. So you just basically have an epileptic fit of energized desire and you explode into mania. That's not good. We can see actually, and just in terms of understanding our own phenomenology, you can see the opposite. The opposite of depression is desire in many ways. In fact, anhedonia, meaning the absence of interest in pleasure, is a pull down of desire. And of course, the opposite of contentment, a passive, is fear. And so these allow you to kind of really, I say this in part because one of the things I note as a clinician is people are so confused about their feelings.
Yeah.
I don't know what they are. They don't know what they do. We get taught that negative feelings are bad. And I'm like, oh, negative feelings are just part of the system. They're not bad in and of themselves.
Right.
There's a huge set of literature on this particular way of thinking about mood and emotion. That's called the circumplex. So we have now identified these valence elements with an energy economic view that creates an active passive and pleasure pain, and that's super consistent with a lot of research in the area. So that's just that's nice for our assimilation integration. And now we'll just set up the potential then to jump from this is a single animal model, meaning we're just the agent arena relationship. We have not talked, I mean, we've alluded, but we haven't really talked about the relational animal. With the care of offspring, I'm using that intentionally. Heidegger, the intimate relational model of being is born. Okay, so obviously other animals are super key. You have to mate with them, you have to compete with them, and all this others. And certainly it's a world of other animal, but it's not relational. Okay, really, it becomes relational, and in particular, the mother offspring then sets the stage for a relational foundation.
Right.
And that then sets the stage for us to potentially talk about then the fourth branch on the tree is called the influence matrix. It's a map of the human relationship system. And to make the connection, we have this model, okay? And so now we're talking about us as social primates. I often talk about as human beings as both primates and persons.
Right, okay? As you should.
And we carry a social primate architecture, like what, the horse and rider, or what John Haidt talked about, the elephant and rider. This is the core of the elephant. And the argument here is that there are motivations and emotions, okay, which are the goal states that are going to them and the energizing states around that. So that's what we're jumping off into, but I wanted us to sort of stop there and see if there are things that you wanted to pick up with the qualia. But I'm prepared to go into relational recursive relevance realization.
No, I'm happy right now with. I mean, I think we had some nice, expository insights, unpacking a little bit more the valence qualia and that connection to the PCE, the pre-consciousness event. I thought that was very fruitful. No, I'm happy about how things are unfolding. I'd like to go into the relational recursive relevance realization.
Great. So this is an area, so again, sort of as a clinician, all right, when people come and they talk to me about their problems, all right, what do I hear over and over and over again is an angst about self, one's relationship with the world, one's relationship with others, the traumas of the past. And what I'm almost always tracking is the head and the heart in the relational world. Right. So this is, that's what then, and what I'm then going to share with you is an aspect of a map. We're going to aspectualize a particular element of the relationship system.
So while you're doing that, I was just going to foreshadow that what you just said, of course, converges with a lot of the work from the meaning in life literature about these relationships mattering to others, so we take care of others, others care about us, Also, we care about our shared world, our cultural world. These are the relationships that are central to meaning in life. I know you're in agreement with this. We're not talking about stuff that's just within the therapeutic context. It broadens into, the whole project of meaning in life. And I'm doing that so that we can foreshadow how this will lead back into a discussion about how this all potentially links back into the meaning crisis.
Well, John, you're making, I actually feel that in my body because I'm actually struggling with my profession a little bit these days for a whole host of different reasons. I am even seriously considering giving up my license. And part of it has to do with, I'm convinced more than ever, and I love my discipline, okay? So it's a complicated relation, as we all have, right, with our home families. But I'm also frustrated with it in certain ways. And one of the things that I believe unbelievably deeply is that we need a wise translation of the wisdom of the therapy room out of the therapy room. Meaning you've got to get it out and into the psychotechnologies, into the schools, into the families, into your heart, and not cloistered in a professional relationship that has confidentiality, wrapped all around it and all of that. I mean, obviously there's a place for that, of course. I spend both my life to that. But so much of the wisdom now is getting professionalized. And it's as though, so you even have to say, what we're not talking about a therapy relationship. We're talking about life. We're talking about brotherhood and sisterhood and being in community and being with self and at every level of being. And you know more than anyone how much potentially the scientific enterprise, at least in its reductive form, has essentially eviscerated our contact with this.
Yeah.
And I really, really want to re-energize that and justify the metaphysics from a natural scientific view, how clearly this is needed and valid at every level of being.
Well, thank you for saying that, Greg. And I just want to do some advertising on, it's somewhat self-promotional, but it's mostly on Greg's behalf. So Chris Mastropietro and I are, Chris is going to join us when we do the Elusive Eye. Yeah. We put together an anthology called Inner and Outer Dialogues, and there's a chapter in there in which Gregg develops very beautifully that argument he just gave us about the need to take what's going on inside the therapeutic dialogue and expand it out so we have a sapiential existential dialogue available to the culture at large. So, and for those of you who are interested in that point that Gregg just made, there is a forthcoming book in which he has a chapter in which he makes that argument very clearly and eloquently.
Great. Thank you, John. Yes, and the book is, I'm super excited of every book that I've contributed to. I think I'm the most excited about this one. It's so you laid it out. And by the way, the inner and outer dialogues, I know in Dialogos, we talk about both vertical alignment, okay, and horizontal alignment.
Yep.
All right. Well, this system, what we're about ready to, is really a way of mapping sort of where the heart is in the intersubjective field. And then on top of that is the justifying system.
Right,
if we can harmonize our heart and our head and our relational world, that's boom, we're a lot of the way there. And there's so much in the world that actually, unfortunately, works against that. But if we tweak it right and align it, actually, the colleague I already mentioned, my sociology colleague, so from a sociological perspective, we're always taught he's working on a project now, a play off of Steve Pinker, but from a sociological angle called The Better Angles of Our Nature.
Right.
Okay. And what he's emphasizing is, how are we aligned or not? Okay. And of course, we've just gone through, and of course, the world is, we're going through this unbelievable election right here, right? This is live for us. And the clash of identity and social force in a particular sort of the ego investment in the clash, and then the shattering of that potentially for everybody's psyche and health, as opposed to the potential harmony. I mean, there are a few things that are in terms of mattering and meaning and how to be in the world. It's really, really important. So.
Well, we did entitle this the Untangling the World, Not the Hard Problems of Consciousness and Meaning, of Mind and Meaning. So and we're now seeing how they bridge together in your work and my work together.
Absolutely.
Keep going, please.
So, okay, so now we're looking to then sync up. We already linked the behavioral investment theory, and now we're going to then see about syncing up the SIMM-RR with the influence matrix.
Right.
Okay? And given the jump into qualia, the valence qualia, we're going to be in good shape, I believe.
Good.
Okay?
Good.
So what is the influence matrix? It's the fourth key idea in the unified theory of knowledge. It maps what's called the human relationship system. I want to be clear over and over again. This will become clear, but this is the embodied participatory perspectival aspect. Okay.
Right.
Now there's clearly going to be loops of narrative self-concept, but all of this is present before any propositional narrative self-concept loop. Okay. Here's going to be a really key point, and I believe this is absolutely central for the meaning crisis and the shifts that we need. And this is the idea about what the core of this backbone is called relational value and social influence, the overlap and difference between these two. In fact, I think it was in your talk with Eric Brown, you actually immediately highlighted this difference. And I think you were talking about your relationship with your partner, because you were made a very clear distinction between, well, there's instrumental movement of other people, right? Like you can get them to do certain things. And then there's actually really valuing them. I wouldn't want to just like learn how to manipulate my wife so that she does stuff. It's like, it's a being and presence of value of who she is, right? Okay.
It's very much perspectival presence and participatory identity. That's what you're after when you're after, loving somebody.
Exactly. And what I'm going to argue is that we want social influence and we want to be known and valued in a particular way. And those things, interestingly, can be aligned or not aligned.
Yes. Yeah, very much.
Okay?
Kind of a Frommian idea too.
Yeah, well, right. And the question of how we align it and the idea is that actually I believe our capitalist system and the capital labor relations make us very vulnerable to tipping into just instrumental influence and gutting relational value in certain ways. And if you do that, you're going to feel empty. You might have a lot of power. You're going to feel empty and hungry inside. And I think we actually see that. So
the reverse is the case too, though, right? Right, because Fromm, although he emphasizes the modal confusion at the expense of the being mode, he says the other is possible. You could have somebody, because I've met these people, the people who are all about caring and loving, and they're just like, we had a phrase in the church I was growing up in, too heavenly minded to be any earthly good, kind of thing, right?
Perfect. Yeah, I mean, to me, Dharma is a question of being and becoming and doing. I mean, and I think that I pulled that some from Daniel Schmachtenberger, although I basically had that frame already, gave a Dharma inquiry. And doing, being, and becoming are all parts here. Another way of thinking about this is, I don't know if you ever saw, Castaway with Tom Hanks?
I love that movie.
Yeah, it's a great movie.
It's perhaps my favorite Tom Hanks movie, actually.
Well, wonderful. Well, he's valued, of course, but of course he has no direct because of the actual physical reality. He's completely no social influence, right? There's no actually concrete way of connecting to people. So he carries the value, but so there are lots of different ways these things can be disconnected.
That's good.
But it's also the case that they're tied together, and both of them we care deeply about.
Yes.
The matrix, that's the black line, and then the matrix also is going to provide a way to understand 3 process dimensions of power, love, and freedom that I'll talk about. And it also, and I've already alluded to this, clarifies the relationship between social motivations and emotions. It also opens up some interesting new possibilities. We've talked about our metaphysics. I believe that the idea of I'll suggest a relational participatory intersubjective space might be a really interesting.
Yeah, we talk about that in, I think with the collective we space. That's the term that opens up. And it has this interesting phenomenology associated with it too. It's also in the Inner Outer Dialogues books. Greg, before you go on, I wanted to ask, is this the place, I might be wrong, is this the place where we see the emotion, because this, I've been doing work on this, on the work I've been doing on the nature and function of the self. Is it this interaction between social motivation and emotions where we get the emergence of what are called the social emotions, like pride and shame and things like that?
Exactly. Now there's debate, and I think people, they'll say that pride, shame, is the Untangling and others will talk about these as being self-conscious emotion, and you'll need certain kinds of self-consciousness. We can get into the fine-grained analysis about I'm going to argue that a non-propositional chimpanzee can feel shame and pride.
I think so too. I'm pretty convinced of that as well.
So, and that's because and we can get into this and what the self is. There's a phenomenological self here that's going to become pretty sophisticated as it manages self-other relation, even though it doesn't have narrative justification.
Right. Well, especially if it has that stuff we were talking about earlier, that ability for metaperspectival counterfactuality. Right. Yeah.
Totally. Okay. So here's but now to really bring you and I in the room together. Okay. So here's, of course, we did all of our stuff completely independently, and met each other, whatever it was, right? But we're climbing up a mountain.
You reached out to me, and thank God you did.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I listened to you on a merge, and then
that happened?
Yeah, and then that got me into the meaning crisis, and then I was like, brother.
yeah, very much,
right. So here's the basic issue, right? We have an idea that the cognitive architecture is structured for recursive relevance realization.
Yep, very much.
Okay? Now we're going to enter into the relational world, okay? Right. And now I'm going to then say, well, what I did with the influence matrix is build a schematic for the way in which you would process relevant relational information.
Right.
Okay, and that it should be recursive across intrapsychically, meaning I'm going to build internal working models. I'm going to be very, and then we're also going to be engaged in participatory dance stuff dynamically. So we're going to get a relational recursive element between people.
Right. That's cool.
Okay. So this issue of does this thing map that and vice versa? Are they in harmony with one another in the relational world? That's our question.
Right.
Okay? And that is completely convergent and independent, and to the extent that it's a lock key match, and this does then say, oh, these would be the kind of features that a social primate should be tracking in the world to realize relevance in the relational world.
Right, that's excellent.
Okay, so now we start with the black line here, okay? And the black line basically says it's relational value, social influence, and we can differentiate the two. But for right now, we'll collapse them. And indeed, in my, I came from an evolutionary view. I used to just call it social influence, and then it became relational value and social influence, which actually, as we've talked about, is a big difference. But it's an important and interesting nuance. And how my own evolution and thinking, I think hopefully maybe we can sort of spread that so that we can all, so we can go from sort of modernist social influence to a meta-modern relational value worldview.
Right.
So relational value is the experience of being known and valued by important others.
Right.
Okay. So note you can be valued, but not necessarily known.
Right.
All right. And actually, I work with this clinically all the time. People are valued, but they feel like imposters.
Ah, I see what you mean. Right.
Okay.
And that's interesting, because that's also where the perspectival sense of presence at the phenomenological level is being manipulated. Yeah. Right.
Well, and this, by the way, is, I think, a uniquely human problem. Okay. And this distinction between known and valued, right, will come because of the problem of justification and the way in which language opens up a highway to us.
Right.
And which sets the stage for me to justify to you, I will put on a face and I will tell you what I am as I hide what I really am.
Yeah.
Okay? And become an imposter so that I get you to love me and get social influence, even as I hide from you what my real self is about. Okay. That's what I call the public-private Rogerian filter, because it's like I'm doing it to manage your judgment.
Yeah, you're not going to find any gazelles that are sort of problematic. Nobody knows me.
Right. I mean, there it is. Because they don't have to justify themselves and give accounts for the stage and manage all of that stuff. It's just a totally new. So they care whether they're valued. And I will argue that our whole attachment system when we're born is tracking social influence and value. But it's not, it's known and valued are essentially the same until you start to get self-consciousness and justification.
Yeah, I see that. That's a good point. That's very good.
And then social influence is this pragmatic capacity to move others in accordance with your influence. Okay. So, and then the matrix says there are these motives. These are going to be these templates to approach and avoid. And then they're going to be emotions, okay, which energize. And then you're going to then see, okay, that the high is going to then energize one way or the other.
Right.
Okay? And then we can sort of test this phenomenologically. And the test I have my students go through is sort of, well, all right, it should be the case that we're tracking relevant, realized, emotionally charged information that will be remembered in our episodic memory that's key to self.
That's
Okay?
right.
So audience, you can do this a little bit. So I asked folks, go back to your adolescence, okay, and then pick out one memory that you associate with joy, okay, and a positive memory for you.
Mm-hmm.
And then pick out one memory that's really sad, okay,
Right.
negative, that was painful for you.
Right.
Okay. So I'll share with you mine. These are the classic ones when I do this exercise.
Okay.
Right? So for me, when I was 12, all right, my dad was a soccer coach, okay, and we were a really good team for 3 years, and our arch rival was Mantua. To this day, I remember it, okay?
Yeah.
And this was the second year. We won the trophy the year before. We were in a battle with them. We're ahead 1-0. I'm the goalie, okay? They come bursting down. There's 5 minutes left to go. They shoot. I dive, bounce it out. Great save. They shoot again. I go race to the other side, save it, and the crowd, 20 people, go crazy. Right? Okay.
Right.
And I look over at my dad, and I get eye-to-eye contact with my coach, and him saying this. And now I've achieved something that people see in me, right? Okay.
Yeah.
And then I to this day, I still get cellular activation when I have that, my little, as the highlight of my sports career, John, but there it is. Okay. So there's that. Now, the other memory that I have, okay, fast forward 4 years or so, 16, I did not have a good judge on my mate value criteria when I was 16, so I was always overshooting. Okay, all right. So that set me up for some pain. So this one girl, Christine, was like the head of the cheerleading squad. All right. So at break, I had attracted to her, and I thought maybe we go out on a date. So I pulled together a rose, all right, and a note, and I said, "Hey, Christine, will you, have dinner with me?" Okay. And then during break, which is second and third periods, I went up to her. I didn't know her very well. I gave her the bag and ran off. Okay. So then fast forward to lunch, all right? And I get there a little early, and I sit down, and 2 tables over are the cheerleaders, okay? Right. And in the middle of the group is, guess what? My rose and bag,
right?
Okay? And everybody's laughing.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh.
So there you go. You see, you're an empathetic character. You can feel exactly that this isn't my positive memory. So as your 16-year-old, but your buddies aren't there, the space is between you, 2 tables down, and the entire system is looking at you going, and you are just naked and embarrassed, right?
Right.
And I was, yeah. It was like, oh.
Right.
Yeah, so there it is. So relational value, social influence, that's sort of the archetype. Okay.
Right.
And so that's the invitation, folks, is, when did you fall? What do you remember? You're going to remember achievement that people recognize. You're going to remember falling in love. You're going to remember heartbreaks. You're going to remember embarrassment. You're going to remember betrayal, generally, trauma. Okay. And the argument is that over and over again, and I certainly find this, I certainly see it clinically, is that over and over again, there are these very powerful self-other relations, right, that speak to one's relational value and social influence, and they really get then seared into the consciousness and become core templates of one's worth or not, and how others will see and experience you.
It goes towards the sort of the felt evaluative sense of the self to some significant degree.
Totally. Yep. Which and then how we regulate that. Okay, there's a trauma, a trust when it's injured, and then how we try to protect against that, defend.
Yeah. So
much of the ego, it's then really concerned. We're trying to avoid that, protect that, justify why that's not going to happen, why it doesn't deserve to happen. So that's and the whole point of it is this is all relevance realization stuff, obviously, right?
Very much.
It's like, what am I going to pay attention to, and then what's the valence qualia? What am I aspectualizing, and what does it mean? And now as a higher order primate, I'm like, what does it mean about me? I guess I'm not very dateable.
Right.
It worked out okay. My high school sweetheart, actually, 2 years later, we're still married today. So the story ends happy.
Good. Thanks for the happy ending.
Still some neurotic insecurities, but welcome to humanity, right? So that's the core. Okay. And now there's these three relational process dimensions. Very key to emphasize the term process, which basically means I'm going to track the self-other relational frame.
Right,
okay?
right.
And the process by which we're positioning ourselves.
Yeah,
okay?
right.
And I make a note, like we talk about process all the time, it's the how of the relational exchange and the relative positions. And that's can be very different than content. As I say, sex and the movies and doing laundry are not on the matrix. okay.
Right.
Okay. But whether or not you're really enjoying sex or fighting over sex or doing the laundry together or fighting over it, that's going to be the process dimensions are what, and it is those process dimensions that are relatively invariant, meaning everywhere you go in the dynamic participatory world, these are the variables. Okay. These are the social space matrices that allow you to constrain and frame the self in relation to other.
Right, the universal process, exactly.
Okay, and so one of them is power, and we're going to see it's indirect and indirect ranking competition. One's love, so red line, and then freedom, avoiding obligation and being controlled. These are the basic descriptions of them. If we then put them on the matrix, the first, or could go any, then see power ranked this way. So this is the, we can think about this as relative rank, status, control, defined by the poles of dominance and submission, a sense of being vertical in relation. And in fact, actually we now know actually the way people think about social, they actually are co-opting the space system, the three-dimensional space system for the relational system. Okay, that's really interesting.
Yep, and also the perspectival, because it maps up to construal level. People talk about construal level, the same thing, right?
Yep, 100%. We can think about this also in direct and indirect terms. Direct is zero sum, like somebody has power and doesn't, like a boss and then indirect is your, hey, I have a Ferrari, look at me, I got these great GRE scores. Those don't necessarily translate, but they signal indirect status and rank.
Right.
Then we go to the second domain, and then that's the love axis, cooperative influence via altruism and affiliation. There's going to be different classes of this, and I'm on the positive side here of affiliation, kin, friend, partner. There's also moral care, like I really care about anybody that's getting injured. There's an interesting what gives rise to that. So what is affiliation? Affiliation is a process of internalizing the other's interests and joining with them. Okay. So you can see this, like when my son was injured, I felt pain.
Yeah.
Okay, just seeing him in pain, to this day, it's like, oh my God, I want to hold you and protect you. And so it's like I'm in pain. And those of, so that's affiliation and identify. In fact, there's actually good brain evidence that's really sort of, creates static between you and the other, so that you really do have this blended feeling of interest.
Very much, very much.
Okay? Hostility is actually just basically the reverse. You separate interest, that's the other, that's definitely not like me. And then I'm going to be antagonistically positioned because that person's going to get in the way of my interests.
Right.
Okay? There's something that's in the way, and that will energize me to potentially expend energy to harm them. Okay. Right. You may have rage is the more active, and then contempt is a little bit more conservative. Disgust, I'm just going to move away. Okay. But rage and contempt are going to be the extremes of these. So then the last dimension here is called freedom. It's really an autonomy dependency axis. Right. Autonomy is the capacity to function independent and be free from the undue influence of others. Okay. Dependency is the extent to which one requires others to function effectively. I think it's helpful to divide this up a little further into the following depiction here that has autonomy and interdependency as the balance between those is healthy and is going to be associated with high relational value, social influence, because we are social creatures that are embedded. So we need, and then the extremes of that are what's called counter and hyperdependency.
Oh, I see.
Right. In terms of, and those are indications, going to be indications of more low influence. We're also going to see, if we look at this through the lens of the attachment literature, we're going to see very clearly the domain of the insecure. There's a counter-dependent of avoidant, what actually Bowlby originally calls counterdependency, which I wish we had SIM, and then the ambivalent, which we originally calls hyperdependency, and we stayed with those. Or disorganized, which is bouncing back and forth because things are so crazy.
That's lack of optimal.
And secure attachment, when you have a safe haven, when you connect to other people, you feel valued and they're getting those needs met. Because there's a nice balance usually between your capacity of competition and love, autonomy and interdependency, you're able to keep the constraints in the domain of feeling known and valued and having social influence. It then maps, we can then map the self-other relations in social space this way. Okay, so this is the basic domain. And now we add the emotions on the outer ring.
Right.
Okay, so we already did that. And then one of the things about this is that it orients us. I see this clinically all the time. There's a now difference between other oriented strategies. Okay, so now I can basically, hey, am I going to attend to you? I'm going to put you first. And what that means, I'm going to reward you or punish me. Okay?
Right.
And I'll have feelings of shame, guilt, and love.
Right.
Okay? Or I'll be self-oriented. All right, reward self, punish other, have hate, anger should come pride up right there. So this is an archetypal in personality theory, agency versus communion. This issue of whether you're selfish or other oriented is a ubiquitous element. In fact, Theodore Milan argues in terms of the fundamental sort of energies and prototypes. You got pleasure, pain, active, passive, and then a self-other dialectic.
Right.
That's really foundational. So I can tell you clinically that you see that very knowing instantaneously whether you're dealing with self, other, disorganized is something you pick up on real quick in the clinical. So the last thing that I'll do, and then we'll come off and see where to go, is I'm going to put this then in the context of some of the things that we were talking about before about where are we. There's of course the metaphysical, and there's the meta-theoretical element, okay, which we can now add the matrix to, is sort of like, okay, so meta-theoretical. Right. I'm going to come back to the metaphysical, that's where we can end. But now if we do, where is the influence matrix on the unified theory of psychology? It fits really in between behavioral investment theory in the sense that lays the groundwork and the architecture. Yeah. Then you have the social system. And then when we get to propositional knowing self-consciousness, it sort of fits in many ways in between the two.
Right. Okay. This is a very Platonic model in some ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's certainly, I've been more Platonic lately. I was 90% Aristotle a while ago. Now I'm like, I don't even know. So it's grounding just in terms of giving honor to the tradition. It's grounded in what's called the circumplex model, interpersonal circumplex model. Actually, Timothy Leary, the guy that did acid and all that good stuff. Before that, he was a professor at Harvard, developed a circumplex model. That's where it has this.
I didn't know that. Wow, thank you.
Yeah, no, yeah. So, yep, he was a Harvard professor of personality and identified this. And by the way, if you know anything about like Harry Stack Sullivan, so Harry Stack Sullivan, interpersonal models coming off of Freud, identifies power and love. And then Timothy Leary also pulls that and identifies dominance and nurturance. So right. If you know the legacy then into psychoanalytic, this goes back, by the way, into aggression and sex. The right. energy of aggression and sex gets translated socially into power and love, and then into personality world gets then identified in competition cooperation. So that's an interesting lineage.
That's cool.
To connect. And the other is attachment theory.
Yeah, we've been talking on and off about for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. And once we have those two, there are actually a lot of other, just like we did with the whole SIMM-RR kind of model. You know, this is an assimilative and integrative model for a wide variety of different perspectives. So another sort of psychodynamic, Erik Erikson's psychosocial developmental frame actually has ubiquitous themes of self and relationship to other. And this goes through the developmental life history model, okay, so that you're concerned with different things at different stages in your history.
Yep.
Okay? And I'm just flashing that up. The last thing then that I'll say is it maps this intrapsychic, interpersonal, self-other social space-time. It sets the stage for a conception of an implicit intersubjective frame. And then this gives rise to this whole idea of mind to be. Okay, remember we were doing 1As, 1Bs, those kinds of deals. So we have our basic map of the mind. And then we add this idea of our capacity. We see, you know, the eyes as windows to the soul. What do people mean by that? Okay. For me, the idea is there's this implicit intersubjective shared attentional space, intimate relational modeling. And of course, I like that, you know me, I like plays on words. So mind to be, and James Mark Baldwin said, ego and alter are born together. I love that phrase. And us as attachments. So the ground of self really is grounded in an attachment relational structure as it's born to meet those needs. One of my colleagues, Darsha Narvaez, talks about the nest in which we need to cultivate development. And fundamentally, it's about creating a secure, embedded, really cultivating our sort of oral indigenous heritage, which should be sort of the community nest in which people are on, and then that's going to feel known and valued, and that's going to lay a foundation of security, as opposed to, well, too often in our meaning and mental health crisis, foundations of meaninglessness, insecurity, fragmentation, isolation, loneliness.
That was great. That was really good, Greg. Thank you for taking us through that. I know you have a lot more behind all of this. Everybody should know that what we're seeing here is Greg has this, and he's doing massive data compression for us here. But I found that very clear, and very elegant. Your capacity for systematization is really, really impressive. So I've been commenting all the way through and making connections, but I think that's fantastic. And I think the connections between, taking relevance realization up into relational relevance realization, I think that's going to be so important when we do the elusive I, and we talk, and you already were alluding to it, the emergence of the self, and what does that mean, and whether or not the self actually exists. If the self is socially constructed, is it only socially attributed? Is it just an illusion? Those are sort of the philosophical questions. And then what are these functions? One area that I'm doing a lot of work on, where the relational, social relational stuff and the cognitive stuff come together, is in the function of what's called self-relevance, right? And how that's the glue of the self, and that I think that will really even tighten the connections of relevance realization and relational relevance realization. We've got a lot more to do, but
a lot more to do.
Yeah.
Right. When you're doing sort of one of the, in the cognitive science world, that echoes like the cocktail party phenomenon, right? Like you're all of a sudden you hear your name, Greg, and it's like, hey, are they talking about me? Right.
Yeah. But that's one of the early, and notice how that's an effect on attention and salience, right? And even orientation, right? And all that stuff. Right. So rich and juicy. And then of course, the connections between self and consciousness in self-consciousness. Self-consciousness came up repeatedly. So there's a lot more we're going to get to unpack. And when Chris is here, he's going to want to riff on you a lot on the Kierkegaardian stuff about self and other. I'm really looking forward to the next series. But I gotta stop that. That's one of my besetting things. I gotta finish the project I'm in, which is. So what's in store for us next time, Greg?
Let me just say that the prepping this and thinking, the idea of recursive relevance realization, has so fine-tuned. It just takes out like this little diamond lens for me, and pulls out this sort of schematic that I have, but allows it to be so much more elegantly refined, especially on the social cognitive side. So remember, I'm on the emotion motivation side mostly, and I think people should understand that there's a cognitive line of understanding. That's why we split off cognitive, and of course the mental is really, there are differences. So anyway, I just want you to know at the social perception, the cognitive processing line, the elegance of the recursive relevance realization, to then go through the architecture of that, it's brought the influence matrix into life to me in the last week in a way that I just feel thankful for, because that's an old system in mind, but it actually is honing in some specificities around niche details that I didn't have access to before. So that's what I mean by the synergy is intense sometimes.
Yeah. Great.
So the next, so basically we'll sort of round out what I'm seeing now is sort of, okay, so now the lock and key function between our systems, really, I hope, certainly for me and maybe the audience is feeling it. We'll put a top on this at the person level, We're going to bring propositional personhood into the equation, right? And then once we have that, then we'll have sort of the model of human psychology that I operate from, And I think that'll be then right around the whole recursive relevance realization. And that's then going to set the stage for, well, where are we in terms of the meaning crisis?
Yep.
You know, and why is this so important? My argument, I think your argument also, is that the modern scientific, revolution, although it ultimately gives us cognitive science and psychology, it's taken us a long time to get adequate models.
Yeah, totally.
And I think it's gutted us in many ways. And I think that, so now, ultimately, if we can sit here and say, actually, we should not be just manipulating people as objects because all they are reinforcement agencies, but they actually have a fundamental soul at the descriptive level of a functional form, and to be known and valued is central. Of course, obviously, some humanists are saying that for a long time, but if we have a frame for that, I think that that's very, very important for answering core questions, creating dialogos, and cultivating the kind of wisdom awakening that we're open for.
That's fantastic. Well, that's a great place to end today. That's excellent. So thank you so very much, my friend. And well, we'll be together again. I'm sure you'll be texting me throughout the week, which is great.
Sorry about that. I get all excited.
Why are you apologizing? We were working together. I mean,
that's totally true.
And it's great. But that's it for today, everyone. And as Gregg foreshadowed, we've got some really interesting stuff coming to finish this series off. And we will have one final episode where we sort of cull through. We can't answer everybody's for obvious reasons. We'll look through the questions. We'll look through the comments. We'll come up with some potential responses. Or if we don't have a response, we'll at least enter into dialogue about it. And then, like I said, Gregg and Chris and I are going to do a follow-up, in some ways, a follow-up series on the elusive I, the nature and function of the self. And we're going to get into really weird stuff in the altered states of consciousness stuff, why that might impact on the sense of self. Gregg and I might talk a little bit within Untangling the World, not about why altering your state of consciousness might have an impact on meaning. Gregg and I, we've done, I think, was it 2, Gregg, or 2 Psychology Today blogs on the 11th problem of consciousness, and we might want to discuss that because we're getting to the place where that's appropriate. So it's
we're gonna get an optimal grip on all this, John.
Yeah.